The Chosen is often seen as one of the places that symbolizes the Cold War. This region was ruled by Japan for a long time after the Korea under Japanese rule.
To govern, Japan established an institution called the Government General of Korea.
Japan conducted politics on the Chosen through the office of the Governor General. The development policy at the time was to make the North the center of heavy industry. The South became the center of agriculture and small and medium-sized industries. In this way, each region had its own distinctive characteristics. As a result, by the end of World War II, a large imbalance had developed in the economic foundations of the Chosen between North and South Korea. It was becoming unbalanced. Thus, the Chosen was liberated with the end of the war and Japan's defeat. This liberation was influenced by the victory of the Allied powers, including the United States and the Soviet Union. Therefore, the big question that arose in Chosen after liberation was who would lead Chosen and how. Chosen independence activists then decided to establish a new nation and set up the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence. The founding of the People's Republic of Korea was then declared by this Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence for the founding of the People's Republic of Korea. However, it was the United States and the Soviet Union that did not approve of these actions by the Chosen side. Both countries did not accept the voices of the independence activists and did not recognize the new state declared by the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence. After negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Soviet Army occupied the north side of the 38th parallel north, while the American Army occupied the south side. We have decided on such a policy. Thus, the Chosen was divided. In the northern part of the Chosen, an industrial base centered on heavy industry remained. The economic situation on the northern side of the Chosen has become relatively favorable. The southern part of the Chosen had an agricultural-centered economic structure, and the post-war chaos led to serious inflation and food shortages. The southern part of the Chosen was forced into a situation where it had no choice but to rely on support from the United States. In this situation, the question arose as to how to handle the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence. In this respect, the United States and the Soviet Union took contrasting approaches. The Soviet Union adopted a policy of utilizing the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence formed by Chosen and the People's Committee that had spread throughout the country in occupation rule. The Soviet Union was not adequately prepared for the occupation of Chosen. This was because they decided that governing would be smoother if they based it on the chosen organizations of the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence and the People's Committee. In the northern part of the Chosen, the Soviet civil administration provided guidance and supervision to chosen organizations. The country adopted a system of indirect rule in which chosen organizations were responsible for local administration. The United States did not recognize the organization created by the Chosen as an official governing body. The U.S. has adopted a policy of dismantling them. This is because the United States decided that it would be easier to govern by utilizing the administrative system created by Japan for the time being. In the southern part of the Chosen organizations such as the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence lost their authority. The U.S. military government in Korea adopted a system of direct rule, with the government directly responsible for administration. As a result of these circumstances, the northern and southern parts of the Chosen ended up following separate paths. However, dissatisfaction with this political system was growing in the southern part of the Chosen. In the northern part of the Chosen, ethnic Chosen participate in politics. In the southern part of the Chosen cannot participate in politics. Such voices were widespread. Moreover, the administration of the southern part of the Chosen essentially inherited the system of the Government General of Korea. Naturally, this includes many bureaucrats known as the New Japan faction who cooperated with Japan during the war. In response to this situation, there are nationalists who believe that the Chosen people should take the lead in politics. There are anti-Japanese people who argue that the New Japan faction should be eliminated. There are communists who believe that American capitalism should not be accepted. Various forces came together to launch a general strike. This general strike resulted in the deaths of civilians as a result of police firing. This led to a surge of public discontent. Eventually, the general strike escalated into an abandonment of the people. The U.S. military government in Korea imposed martial law and began to suppress the rebellion. The U.S. military government in Korea, including the former Shin-Nihon faction, came into conflict with forces centered around nationalists and communists. The political structure of the South was taking shape. In this situation, the Soviet Union and the United States each focused on different individuals. There Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee. Kim Il-sung led a resistance movement against Japan in Manchuria during the war. Kim Il-sung later moved to Soviet territory and received Soviet support. At the end of the war, Kim Il-sung was stationed in a military camp within Soviet territory. Unlike Kim Il-sung, there are communists on the Chosen who continued to hide and be active within the country during the war. Some studied in Moscow and were sent there by the Comintern. In other words, there were multiple factions within the communists and no consensus. To sort the situation out, the Soviet Union united the communists in the north and established the Chosen branch of the Communist Party of Chosen. Once they were sure that the organization was in place, they brought Kim Il-sung before the citizens of Pyongyang and introduced him to the public as a hero of the anti-Japanese movement. Syngman Rhee is a distant relative of the Chosen royal family. During the war, Syngman Rhee continued to argue in the United States that American power was necessary for Chosen independence. However, there is no need for American power within Chosen. There are many forces within Chosen that believe they should achieve independence through their own efforts. Syngman Rhee's idea was simply to change the ruler from Japan to America. Syngman Rhee was criticized for wanting to sell the country to the United States. Syngman Rhee was not very popular at this time. Since the independence of the Chosen that was actually achieved was heavily dependent on American power, Syngman Rhee's reputation rose dramatically. Upon hearing the news of the end of the war, Syngman Rhee decided to return to the Chosen with the support of the United States. At the same time, a meeting between the foreign ministers of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union was taking place in Moscow. The topic of the meeting was post-war settlement around the world. The future direction of the Chosen is being discussed without any representatives from the Chosen Peninsula. At the time, the United States wanted to prevent the Soviet Union from expanding southward. The Soviet Union wanted to establish a government similar to its own to guarantee its security. The two sides had conflicting aims, making it difficult to reach a compromise. The ultimate goal is to establish a unified government in Chosen. To this end, the United States and the Soviet Union set up a joint committee. The United States then agreed to a policy of implementing trusteeship for up to 5 years. At this joint committee, the United States and the Soviet Union held discussions and confirmed their goal of establishing a unified and independent government within 5 years. However, both the United States and the Soviet Union wanted to keep Chosen within their spheres of influence. Both countries sought to establish independent, unified nations that would be effective for their own countries. In such a situation, even if a joint committee is established, no agreement will be reached. Chosen independence activists strongly opposed the agreement. The future of Chosen was decided without any Chosen present. They were furious that this agreement ignored the wishes of the Chosen people. People were more concerned about accepting trusteeship than about establishing a unity government. The Chosen was divided into those in favor of trusteeship and those opposed, resulting in fierce conflict. Political struggles, with demonstrations and clashes, erupt across the Chosen. At the same time, the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was becoming increasingly serious. As a result, the Joint Committee established to discuss the future of the Chosen also came into conflict due to differences of opinion between the United States and the Soviet Union. I was in a position where I couldn't make any decisions. Finally, the United States decided that trusteeship was not possible. The United States decides to end negotiations with the Soviet Union. The United States has decided to bring the Chosen issue to the United Nations. The United Nations General Assembly decided through a US-led resolution to hold general elections in both North and South Korea under UN supervision. Naturally, the Soviet Union strongly opposed this. Because the South has a larger population, holding a unified election would put the North at a disadvantage. Therefore, the North insisted that no general elections would be held and refused to allow UN personnel to enter the North. As elections in the North were no longer possible, the UN decided to hold elections in the South alone. However, in the South as well, the war situation accelerated the division between North and South. Forces that were opposed to holding elections rejected the idea. As a result, forces seeking independence for the South alone came to hold a majority in parliament. However, the candidates who received the most votes were independent candidates who were not affiliated with any political party. The National Association for Korean Independence, which was considered to be Syngman Rhee's support base, ended up as the second largest party. As can be seen from this seat composition, it could hardly be said that Syngman Rhee had the support of the people at that time. However, it is true that members of parliament were elected in the South. With this composition of members, work will proceed on drafting a new constitution. Thus, the Diet convened and discussions on creating a constitution began. During this debate, Syngman Rhee strongly argued that the new country should adopt a presidential system. He maintained that attitude until the very end. This argument was ultimately accepted, and the new national system was adopted as a presidential system. However, at this stage, the president is chosen by a vote of members of parliament. The president's powers are limited by the National Assembly and he does not have great powers. Syngman Rhee was elected president in the election held by the National Assembly. The Republic of Korea, or South Korea, was officially declared. When South Korea declared its national independence in this way, the Chosen strongly opposed it. The Chosen has also officially implemented its constitution. The Chosen held elections based on its constitution and established the Supreme People's Assembly, a legislative body. The founding of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or Chosen, was then proclaimed with Kim Il-sung as Prime Minister. With the establishment of South Korea and North Korea, two nations now exist side by side on the Korean Peninsula. Both sides came to claim to be the legitimate government of the Korean Peninsula. Moreover, neither Syngman Rhee of South Korea nor Kim Il-sung of North Korea had given up on the unification of the Korean Peninsula. Syngman Rhee advocated for the northward unification, while Kim Il-sung continued to advocate the territorial integrity. Both sides publicly declared their intention to use force to destroy or subjugate the other. However, once the new nations of South Korea and North Korea were established, the United States and the Soviet Union each withdrew their main forces from the Korean Peninsula. At that time, South Korea and North Korea did not have the military power alone to force the other side to surrender. Therefore, both countries sought to unify the Korean Peninsula with the recognition and assistance of the United States and the Soviet Union, respectively. The United States feared that providing large-scale military aid to South Korea might lead to an attack on the North, so it did not provide South Korea with heavy equipment such as tanks or airplanes. Meanwhile, when the Soviet Union withdrew from the Korean Peninsula, it transferred large amounts of military supplies and equipment to North Korea. But Stalin feared war with America. Stalin did not approve Kim Il-sung's attack on South Korea because it could lead to American intervention on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea continued to purchase weapons, tanks, aircraft, and ammunition from the Soviet Union, and continued to strengthen its military. As the United States and the Soviet Union withdrew their main forces from the Korean Peninsula, the armies of North and South Korea faced off directly at the 38th parallel. As a result, conflicts between the armies of North and South Korea became more frequent along the border. These small-scale clashes mainly involved crossing borders to steal rice and food, and fighting over high ground. However, it seems that the North Korean military also aimed to gauge the strength of the South Korean military. Through these clashes, North Korea has concluded that its military equipment is superior to that of the South Korean military and that its training is also more sophisticated. Meanwhile, the Chinese Civil War ended and the People's Republic of China was established. Naturally, this incident provided a strong stimulus to North Korea's leaders. When the Communist Party expelled Chiang Kai-shek, calls arose in North Korea for Syngman Rhee to be expelled as well, further increasing the need for the unification of the Korean Peninsula. However, even at this point, Stalin had not given Kim Il-sung permission to invade the South. However, three important events occurred in succession that dramatically changed the situation. These were the successful nuclear test, the Atchison speech, and the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. These three events marked a turning point, and the Soviet Union gradually leaned toward accepting North Korea's invasion of the South. Now let's take a look at the contents one by one. The first was the successful nuclear test by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union used spies to obtain information from the United States while developing the atomic bomb. Finally, the Soviet Union successfully conducted its first nuclear test. This ended America's nuclear monopoly. Therefore, Stalin of the Soviet Union became confident that the Soviet Union could compete with the United States. Meanwhile, in the United States, anxiety spread among defense officials and scientists about the balance of military power between the United States and the Soviet Union. As a result, debate began within and outside the US government about whether to develop a more powerful weapon, the hydrogen bomb. Hydrogen bomb, also known as thermonuclear weapons, are a new type of weapon with far greater destructive power than atomic bombs. Ultimately, President Truman decided to go ahead with the development. The second is the Atchison speech. Around this time, U.S. Secretary of State Atchison gave a speech on Asian policy. The speech expressed the idea that an archipelago war stretching from the Aleutian Islands through Okinawa in Japan to the Philippines is crucial to American security. However, the problem was that this defense line description did not include South Korea and Taiwan. Therefore, the Soviet Union thought that if North Korea invaded the South, the United States would not intervene. The third is the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. This treaty was signed between China and the Soviet Union and guaranteed the prevention of aggression by Japan and any country allied with Japan in some way, namely the United States. The treaty provided that China and the Soviet Union would assist each other against such aggression. In response to this global situation, the Soviet Union believed that the power of the Eastern Bloc countries was increasing. These three important events led Stalin to believe that the United States would not intervene if North Korea invaded the South. The Soviet Union then began supporting the People's Republic of China on the United Nations Security Council. The Soviet Union then began to insist on excluding the Republic of China from the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member and instead recognizing the People's Republic of China as its representative. However, this proposal drew opposition from the United States and was not accepted. The Soviet Union therefore boycotted the Security Council's activities. Furthermore, the Soviet Union allowed Kim Il-sung to attack South Korea on the condition that he obtained China's approval, and decided to provide aid to North Korea. Kim Il-sung finally succeeded in gaining the recognition of the Soviet Union. The only remaining condition for North Korea was to obtain the approval of China's Mao Zedong. So Kim Il-sung went to Beijing and met with Mao Zedong. At this time, Mao Zedong wanted to prioritize military action against Taiwan. However, he ultimately agreed with North Korea's plan to invade the South and showed a willingness to support it. Having thus gained recognition from the Soviet Union and China, North Korea began full-scale preparations for an invasion of the South. North Korea asked a military advisory group from the Soviet Union to draw up a plan for an invasion of the South. The plan was created at the initiative of the Soviet Union military and then translated by the North Korean military. The first step of this plan was for the North Korean army to break through the South Korean defense line and destroy its main force. Specifically, the North Korean army was to occupy Seoul as quickly as possible and advance as far as the Suwon, Wonju, and Samchik lines. If this step was successful, it was expected that rebel forces within South Korea would take action and South Korea would collapse from within. In the second phase, the North Korean military will further its attack and crush South Korean reserve forces. The target areas for expansion were the Gunsan, Daegu, and Pohang lines. In the third phase, North Korean forces would wipe out the remaining South Korean forces and unify the entire Korean peninsula. The most important point of this plan was that the success of the first phase, which was to destroy the main South Korean military forces before the North Korean army could occupy Seoul, held the key to everything. Under this plan, the North Korean military deployed troops near the 38th parallel under the pretext of military tactical training. Meanwhile, South Korea was holding its second general election. In this election, the ruling party led by Syngman suffered a major defeat, greatly shaking the foundation of the government. At that time, South Korea adopted an indirect presidential election in which the National Assembly chose the president. Therefore, the ruling party's disadvantage in the National Assembly meant that it was more likely that Syngman would not be elected in the next presidential election. Syngman had to do something about the situation. In response to this situation, he wanted to change the presidential election from an indirect presidential election to a direct election by the people. The North Korean military ordered military tactical training at a time when the situation in South Korea was unstable, which temporarily put the South Korean military on alert level. However, after about 2 weeks, the alert was lifted and many troops were allowed to go out and take leave. At that time in South Korea, there was a strong feeling that the North Korean army would not attack, and people were living in peace. However, on June 25, 1950, under these circumstances, North Korean forces finally crossed the 38th parallel north and began their invasion of South Korea. The Korean War broke out. At the start of the Korean War, North Korean forces launched a simultaneous barrage along the 38th parallel north. Shortly afterwards, a massive army of tens of thousands crossed the 38th parallel north and invaded south with furious force. The North Korean military believed that capturing Seoul would decide the outcome of the war and had made detailed plans before the war began. The forces responsible for capturing Seoul were primarily established within North Korea. They advanced to surround Seoul, cutting off the South Korean army's retreat. In addition, troops returning from overseas were stationed around Seoul and deployed to areas outside of Seoul. In other words, the North Korean military was aiming to surround Seoul in 2 layers. The South Korean military, on the other hand, had also stationed forces at the 38th parallel north. However, at that time, clashes between the North and South Korean armies were occurring frequently over a long period of time. As a result, many people thought this is probably just another provocation by the North Korean military. Furthermore, at the start of the war, many soldiers were away from the front lines on leave or on tours. In addition, 1/3 of the equipment had also been sent behind the 38th parallel north for maintenance. As a result of these circumstances, the North Korean invasion came as a complete surprise to the South Korean side. The South Korean side's response was significantly delayed, and the situation quickly fell into chaos. The South Korean government took the situation seriously and immediately requested assistance from the United States and the United Nations. At that time, when President Truman received reports that North Korea had invaded the South, he immediately deemed it a serious crisis. He believed the attack was backed by the Soviet Union. He also believed that if the United States did not take countermeasures there, the Soviet Union would repeat its aggression in other regions. The basic principle of U.S. security policy at the time was that the United States will defend its allies. Therefore, if the United States were to abandon the Korean Peninsula, it would affect America's credibility and risk the collapse of the alliance system itself. Moreover, following the communistization of China, the United States felt a strong sense of crisis about the situation in East Asia. North Korea's actions also posed a clear challenge to the authority of the fledgling United Nations. If we do not counter this blatant act of aggression, it will have a negative impact on the entire international order. Truman made this judgment and viewed the situation not simply as a civil war on the Korean Peninsula but as an invasion by communist forces. President Truman therefore decided to immediately send U.S. naval and air forces to the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. Navy's Far East Naval Forces, which was ordered to deploy, sent part of the U.S. 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait and deployed its main force to Korean waters. The United States made clear its determination to prevent the spread of communism in the Pacific region. The United States immediately called on the United Nations to convene a Security Council. The United States has strongly condemned North Korea's actions, viewing them as a clear violation of international peace and an act of aggression. Furthermore, the United States proposed a resolution calling on North Korea to cease hostilities and immediately withdraw its troops, urging the international community to take action. When the United States began to influence the United Nations in this way, the Soviet Union became the most impatient. At the time, the Soviet Union was protesting the Republic of China's retention of a permanent seat on the Security Council even after the Chinese Revolution. So they were boycotting Security Council meetings. However, this boycott worked to the Soviet Union's disadvantage in an unexpected way. Because the Soviets were absent from the conference, they could not veto power the resolution proposed by the United States. This was a very advantageous situation for the United States at the United Nations. As a result, the conference proceeded without the Soviet Union present, and the U.S. proposals were passed one after another. Thus, the United Nations recommended that member states provide necessary assistance to South Korea to eliminate armed attacks and restore peace. Furthermore, military assistance will be provided under the U.S.-led United Nations Command. The commander will also be appointed by the United States. Thus, the Korean War developed into an international issue, and its impact naturally reached China as well. Initially, China viewed the Korean War as a civil war within the Korean Peninsula. However, with the United States beginning to intervene, the situation is no longer something that concerns them. In particular, the deployment of the U.S. 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait made them very wary. They felt that American influence was closing in on them from three directions: Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam. They became aware of a major threat. As a result, they decided to postpone their originally planned operation to liberate Taiwan and instead focus on strengthening the defenses of the northeastern region. Additionally, they provided military assistance to Vietnam to stabilize the border area and prepare to focus on the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Then, public opinion and trends within the country gradually shifted toward countering the United States and aiding North Korea. However, their higher priority was the pacification of Taiwan and Tibet. Their intervention in the Korean War would have given the United States an excuse to attack mainland China. It also threatened to give momentum to Chiang Kai-shek's counterattack on the mainland policy. For these reasons, China was cautious in refraining from taking action at that stage. Even as the international situation changed dramatically, the North Korean army continued its relentless advance, eventually approaching Seoul. There were two main routes that the North Korean army could take to attack Seoul. Geographically, whichever route they took, they would eventually meet up north of Seoul. Therefore, the South Korean military decided that this northern defense line must be defended to the death and began preparations. The North Korean military also concentrated its elite troops in an attempt to break through the area. The problem here was that the North Korean forces included tank units. At the time, many of the South Korean military had little experience of seeing a tank. They realized that their equipment was no match for the enemy and panic set in at the front lines. In response to this situation, the South Korean military leadership held an emergency meeting. They considered the crucial policy of whether to defend Seoul or abandon it. However, with the north side of Seoul already collapsing and North Korean forces approaching the city, it was impossible to continue the defense. They finally decided that the South Korean military as an organized military force had collapsed. A policy was then decided to withdraw the government and military headquarters south to await the arrival of U.S. forces. Thus began the South Korean government's plan to escape from Seoul. The government first headed to Suwon, intending to use it as a temporary base. Plans were then made for United Nations forces and South Korean forces to build a defensive line in Daejeon to hold off the North Korean forces. Meanwhile, the North Korean army continued its attack on Seoul, and succeeded in taking the capital just 3 days after the start of the war. There was a huge difference in military power between the North and the South. The war progressed with North Korea in an overwhelming position of superiority. However, the United States did not simply stand by and watch the North Korean army advance. The U.S. Far East Air Forces immediately advanced into the skies over the Korean peninsula and seized air superiority. They then used B-29s, an aircraft launched from aircraft carrier to destroy North Korean airfields, railways, and supply bases one after another. In this way, North Korea's supply lines were completely destroyed. Meanwhile, the North Korean army believed that with its occupation of Seoul, most of the war was over. The communists hiding in the south will rise up. They thought, we can take advantage of the confusion to further expand our military gains, and so remained in Seoul. However, once the U.S. military began to intervene in earnest, the North Korean military also noticed a change in the situation. They hastily restarted their southward advance. Although the United States deployed its Navy and Air Force early on, they were cautious about deploying full-scale ground forces. This is because they were concerned about the South Korean military, which was already in disarray. If they simply lacked military strength, the United States could make up for it with reinforcements. However, if their fighting spirit had been lost, American aid would have been meaningless. Therefore, Douglas MacArthur General flew from Tokyo to Korea to see the situation for himself. He then inspected the area around Seoul, which had just fallen. During this inspection, he asked a nearby South Korean sergeant how long they could defend the Han River. The sergeant replied, "Sir, I'm a soldier. If the company commander orders me to defend this place, I will defend it until I die. If the company commander orders me to retreat, I will retreat." After this exchange, Douglas MacArthur General decided that the South Korean military still had the will to fight. He cabled Washington that ground troops were needed. Upon receiving it, President Truman concluded, "The North Korean military has not stopped its advance despite the UN resolution, so we should send in ground troops." He then officially decided to send in ground troops. As a result, U.S. ground forces stationed in Japan under the command of Douglas MacArthur General were sent to the Korean Peninsula. This was around the time the United States began full-scale intervention in the Korean War. The North Korean Army, which was advancing south, attempted to force its way across the Han River before U.S. Army reinforcements could arrive. North Korean troops quickly repaired bridges that had not yet been destroyed, made them large enough for tanks to cross, and began crossing the Han River, then invaded the south side. In response, the South Korean military retreated to buy time for a counterattack. In this way, the North Korean Army, which continued to advance south, and the American ground forces dispatched to South Korea clashed. At first, people thought that the situation would immediately turn around if the U.S. military entered the war. The advance party's military force was not strong enough to stop the North Korean Army. In response to this situation, the United States was forced to send troops stationed in Japan to the Korean Peninsula one after another. The United Nations forces was created to respond to this war. Douglas MacArthur was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Forces and established the United Nations Forces Command. President Syngman Rhee sent a letter to Douglas MacArthur. Syngman Rhee told Douglas MacArthur, "Our cooperation is necessary to win the war, so as a temporary measure, I will entrust you with command of the Korean military." Douglas MacArthur agreed, and the Korean military came under the command of the United Nations forces. The Korean War was fought under the leadership of the United Nations forces led by the United States. The North Korean military thought, "We must settle this before the United Nations forces begin to move in earnest." The North Korean army decided that this was a race against time and sent reserve forces to the front lines, further increasing the speed of their advance. As a result, the United Nations forces were pushed back to the southern tip of the Korean Peninsula. Just 3 months after the outbreak of the war, North Korean forces seized control of approximately 90% of the Korean Peninsula. The situation at the time was one of a race against time, with the North Korean army competing to see how quickly it could occupy Busan or how quickly United Nations forces reinforcements could arrive. The United Nations forces insisted, as the race against time continued, "We will not withdraw from Korea. There is no Dunkirk in Korea. If you lose even an inch of Korea, you will lose many of your comrades in arms." The United Nations forces continued to defend themselves desperately, with a firm determination to fight to the end. An estimated 700,000 to 800,000 refugees had crowded into this small area. It was an extremely difficult situation, with food, clothing and shelter all at stake. The North Korean army considered this small area to be the site of the final battle and launched multiple attacks. The United Nations forces decided that if this place fell, they would lose Korea, and continued to send supplies to Busan while holding out in a dangerous situation. The North Korean military's usual strategy was to concentrate its forces at one point between Daegu and Busan in order to separate them and attempt a breakthrough. But the big problem here was air superiority. Air superiority remained with the United Nations forces, so concentrating forces on a particular breach point could expose them to heavy bombardment by United Nations forces aircraft. The North Korean army was unable to focus its attacks on one area, but continued to attack on all fronts. However, as the supply ships continued to move south, they were unable to keep up with supplies and replenish troops, and the North Korean military's fighting strength gradually depleted. On the map, it appears that North Korean forces are cornering United Nations forces. However, in reality, the North Korean military had already reached the limits of its military strength and was in a difficult position to maintain. The race against time that ensued in this situation ultimately resulted in United Nations forces reinforcements arriving first. This is where Douglas MacArthur took action. From the moment Douglas MacArthur sent ground troops into South Korea, he had a plan to land new troops behind the North Korean army and surround it with a pincer attack. To realize Douglas MacArthur's plan, a landing point had to be secured behind the North Korean forces. Douglas MacArthur focused on Incheon. Douglas MacArthur's plan was to first land a landing force at Incheon and then advance east to retake Seoul. The follow-up troops followed behind them and advanced south. The subsequent forces were to cooperate with the United Nations forces counterattacking in the Pusan area and surround and annihilate the main force of the North Korean army. The problem here was Incheon's topography. To land at Incheon, they had to approach land through a narrow sea channel. Much of Incheon's coastline consisted of tidal flats, creating extremely unfavorable conditions for a landing. The most suitable period for landing in Incheon was during high tide during spring tides, which only occurred 2 to 3 days a month. The time period was very short. Within the US military, there were many pessimistic opinions that this operation will be difficult to carry out. Douglas MacArthur insisted that the very impossibility of carrying out a surprise attack demonstrates its great effectiveness, and refused to back down from his plan. Douglas MacArthur succeeded in persuading those around him, and the United Nations forces, led by the US military, mobilized 261 ships and approximately 75,000 troops and began landing behind the North Korean forces. This was the Incheon landing operation. The United Nations forces loaded troops and tanks onto ships and began landing towards Incheon. At that time, the North Korean military was committing almost all of its forces to the capture of Pusan, so many inadequately trained troops were stationed in rear areas, including Seoul. The sweep of North Korean forces around Incheon went smoothly. However, after a while the tide began to go out and the boat was forced to leave land. The next high tide is in about 10 hours. The troops that had landed earlier were temporarily left behind on land. The United Nations forces launched planes from aircraft carrier to attack North Korean forces to prevent them from gathering in Incheon. While the landing forces were held off by air support, additional landings of the main force were made from both north and south of Incheon at the second high tide. The North Korean army, which was responsible for rearguard duties, was unable to cope with the United Nations forces landing one after another, and the United Nations forces were able to firmly establish a foothold. After the landing, the United Nations forces began their advance eastward. In order to prevent this, the North Korean military attempted to pincer the United Nations forces from both the south and the north. The closer they got to Seoul, the stronger the North Korean resistance became. However, the United Nations forces continued their advance and recaptured Seoul. As the landing operation at Incheon progressed, the United Nations forces in the Pusan area responded by going on the offensive. Initially, the North Korean troops on the front lines had not received any information that United Nations forces had landed in Incheon, so they continued to defend their positions as usual. However, with their supply lines to the rear cut off, the North Korean army gradually became more impatient. Kim Il-sung ordered a gradual withdrawal. However, as a result of the withdrawal, the North Korean army lost its fighting strength, making it difficult to maintain its front line. As the North Korean army began to collapse, the United Nations forces immediately began their pursuit. The North Korean army could not withstand this pursuit, and soon the front line collapsed. Kim Il-sung ordered the withdrawal of all troops, and the tide of the war quickly turned in favor of the United Nations forces. However, as United Nations forces pushed the North Korean forces back to the 38th parallel, new problems arose. The United Nations had originally adopted a resolution stating that the North Korean forces will be repelled north of the 38th parallel, and that United Nations forces will be sent to that end. And the United Nations forces achieved this goal. However, the United Nations had not yet established a clear policy on what to do next. From here on, there were two main options. The first option is to cross the 38th parallel and aim for the unification of Korea. The second option is to stop the military at the 38th parallel and seek a political solution. There was also disagreement within the United States about which option to choose. This is an argument in favor of the former. The United Nations forces are on the offensive. It's hard to stop moving forward here. If the United Nations forces stop, the 38th parallel could become a permanent border. The claim was that North Korean forces may attack again. This is an argument in favor of the latter. But if they cross the 38th parallel, the Soviet Union and China could intervene. The claim was that it could develop into World War III. Douglas MacArthur was a major influence in this conflict of opinion. Douglas MacArthur believed that the annihilation of the North Korean army is the top priority. To achieve this, we have no choice but to cross the 38th parallel. It is unlikely that the Soviet Union or China will intervene. As these opinions grew stronger, the United States solidified its position in favor of advancing north. By this time, the Soviet Union had returned to the United Nations Security Council. Any new resolution against North Korea would likely be blocked by a Soviet veto power. The United States chose to raise the issue of Korea at the UN General Assembly rather than at the Security Council. Here too, the discussion was difficult. The UN General Assembly ultimately passed a resolution supporting the unification, independence and establishment of a democratic government for Korea. Douglas MacArthur responded by urging Kim Il-sung to surrender, but Kim did not respond. The United Nations forces then crossed the 38th parallel and began their advance into North Korean territory. The situation was completely reversed by the United Nations forces' Incheon landing operation. Kim Il-sung, who was in a critical situation, asked Mao Zedong of China and Stalin of the Soviet Union for military support. In response, Stalin asked Mao Zedong to send in Chinese troops. On the other hand, he called on Kim Il-sung to completely retreat from the North Korean government and recommended that it leave. Even in such circumstances, the United Nations forces continued to advance north, and Pyongyang eventually fell. The North Korean leadership fell into chaos, and defeat became even more likely. In response to these developments in the war, the view grew in the United States that the war would end once the Americans reached the Yalu River, or the border with China. Their attention had already shifted to the question of how to govern the Korean peninsula after the war. Douglas MacArthur ordered all troops to advance to the border at maximum speed. He urges the United Nations forces to advance north. Thus, the United Nations forces advanced deep into North Korean territory. Some units began to reach areas approaching the Yalu River. In response to this situation, serious discussions began in China about how to provide military support to North Korea. A meeting was held within the Communist Party to consider this issue. Mao Zedong insisted that troops should be sent. However, many participants were opposed to this. They could not come to any conclusions. The opposing views were as follows. China's top priority right now is economic recovery. War can have a negative impact on foreign trade. The difference in military power between Japan and the United States is huge. The chances of winning are slim. China was particularly concerned that its military did not have sufficient air power. If China were to send troops, support from the Soviet Air Force would be essential. However, the Soviet military was of the opinion that it did not want to send its own troops. As a result, China is finding it difficult to decide on a policy. Nevertheless, Mao Zedong insisted that if the United Nations forces continued their advance, the northern part of the Korean peninsula would be occupied by American forces. If that happens, China will be threatened by the US military. If we don't stop the American military in Korea, China will be their next target. He emphasized the need for troops. In this situation, China succeeded in making the following promises with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did not send troops to North Korea. However, the Soviet Air Force would cooperate in the defense of northeastern China. Thus, Mao Zedong's argument was finally accepted. The Communist Party decided to send the Chinese People's Volunteer Army to Korea, with Peng Dehuai as its commander-in-chief. They crossed the Yalu River and entered the Korean War. Through these events, the Korean War effectively turned into a battle between the United States and China. At the time, the United States considered China's warning that it would intervene if United Nations forces crossed the 38th parallel to be a bluff. The United States believed that China was unlikely to enter the war. On the other hand, Peng Dehuai noticed that the United Nations forces were divided into two parts, the East and the West, and that the area between them was a weak spot. He launches a local offensive. China quickly deployed forces comparable in size to or even exceeding the United Nations forces on the front lines. This was a surprise attack and the United Nations forces began to withdraw. In this way, the Chinese army succeeded in blocking the United Nations forces' advance north and buying time until reinforcements could arrive. Once reinforcements arrived, they launched a counterattack. The Chinese and North Korean armies suffered heavy losses due to modern American weapons. However, they continued to send in soldiers one after another, regardless of the heavy human losses. They opposed the United Nations forces using what was known as human wave tactics. As a result, the United Nations forces suffered a serious blow and were pushed back in one fell swoop, and the situation finally began to reverse. At this time, there was a growing expectation in the United States that Chinese military intervention would be limited in purpose and would stop near the 38th parallel. The possibility of a truce was being considered. However, Douglas MacArthur, who was in Tokyo, was negative about this view. New situations require new political decisions. He argued that we should attack China using our Navy and Air Force. Meanwhile, China was growing more confident after the success of previous operations. There was a growing opinion that now was the time to cross the 38th parallel and head south, and that this opportunity should not be missed. However, Peng Dehuai, who was aware of the situation on the front lines, argued that supplies were limited and troops were exhausted, and that this issue should be resolved first. In both the United States and China, there was a discrepancy in perception between the central government and the front lines. In response to this situation, President Truman began to consider the possibility of using an atomic bomb to turn the situation around. However, this attitude will have a huge impact on the world. Western countries in particular became deeply concerned that the Korean War could escalate into an all-out conflict between the United States and China, and even lead to the Soviet Union joining the conflict, leading to World War III. If the war were to expand to that extent, Western European countries would inevitably become targets of attack by the Soviet Union. This sense of crisis prompted British Clement Attlee to make an emergency visit to Washington to strongly urge the United States to guarantee that the atomic bomb would not be used. Truman responded by verbally assuring us that the atomic bomb would not be used. However, the question of whether or not to use the atomic bomb continued to be repeatedly considered within the U.S. government. The situation had become critical. And despite the American hope that they would stop near the 38th parallel, the Chinese army continued to advance. They eventually crossed the 38th parallel and occupied Seoul. The American forces were temporarily weakened by the Chinese pushback. However, the Chinese military was inferior to the Americans in terms of firepower and air power, so they were unable to achieve a decisive victory. Furthermore, the extension of Chinese supply lines caused delays in the delivery of new troops. The American forces then gradually regained their confidence and began to counterattack. From this point on, the front lines became stagnant, with repeated advances and retreats around the 38th parallel. At this point, President Truman changed the objective of the war to restoring the 38th parallel. At the same time, he declared a national emergency. This declaration of a national emergency had great significance in post-war America. In the post-war U.S. Congress, there was a strong opinion that military spending on conventional forces should be reduced because of the existence of nuclear weapons. In this atmosphere, President Truman postponed approval of the military expansion budget. However, the declaration of a state of emergency following the Korean War dramatically eased congressional opposition to military spending.
As a result, the United States reversed its policy of drastic reductions in conventional forces that it had pursued since the end of the war and once again embarked on increasing its military strength. As a result, military strength was roughly doubled from the time the Korean War began. The proportion of the federal budget devoted to military spending has jumped to around 60% from levels immediately after World War II. The United States took advantage of the Korean War to dramatically strengthen its military power. They significantly improved their ability to respond to the Cold War. And America would actually reclaim the 38th parallel.
However, President Truman was wary of crossing the 38th parallel again. He had a strong memory of the Chinese army joining the war once the United Nations forces crossed the 38th parallel. Therefore, if United Nations forces next cross the 38th parallel, the Soviet Union might join the war. If that happens, there is a risk that it will develop into World War III. Such anxieties began to cross his mind. Based on this assessment of the situation, Truman argued that since the 38th parallel had been restored, the United Nations forces had accomplished their mission. Further advance north risks becoming bogged down. Here he began to move towards ending the war. However, Douglas MacArthur still maintained an extremely positive stance toward the war. To break the deadlock in the war, he advocated bombing northeastern China in an invasion of the mainland by the Kuomintang army from Taiwan. He even went so far as to advocate the use of the atomic bomb. These claims were in stark opposition to President Truman's policy of avoiding an escalation of the war. In response to the situation, President Truman suddenly relieved Douglas MacArthur of his command. From here, the United States began the path toward a ceasefire, with the goal of bringing China to the negotiating table. It was not just the United States that wanted a ceasefire, the Soviet Union did too. The Soviet Union then contacted the United States through Malik, the Soviet representative on the United Nations Security Council, and proposed a ceasefire. Naturally, the United States also took a positive stance on this, and China and North Korea also responded. Thus began the first armistice negotiations. However, Mao Zedong was wary that the United Nations forces might launch a large-scale attack while ceasefire negotiations were underway. He ordered the Chinese military to increase its military presence in the northeastern region and to maintain strict vigilance at all bases. In fact, on the ground, positional battles were continuing around the 38th parallel. American bombing continued from the air. In other words, even though ceasefire talks began, fighting did not stop and the war continued. Due to the current fighting situation, the first ceasefire negotiations were forced to be suspended. Armistice negotiations then resumed. However, negotiations were difficult due to various issues, such as the setting of a ceasefire line and the method of prisoner exchange. Kim Il-sung had already become the nominal commander-in-chief. He believed that the war could no longer be won and was keen for a quick resolution. However, China's Mao Zedong insisted on the principle that all captured soldiers should be repatriated. He refused to change his policy of continuing the war if this could not be achieved. Furthermore, Stalin of the Soviet Union, who was behind the move, sympathized with North Korea. Stalin felt obligated to China for joining the war on behalf of the Soviet Union, and was forced to support China. However, if the war continued and North Korea continued to suffer damage, the Soviet Union's burden for North Korea's post-war reconstruction would increase. Stalin was thus caught in the middle. He ostensibly argued that the war should continue. But deep down, he began to think that it would be better to end the war. After 2 years of negotiations, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was finally signed at Panmunjom. As a result of the Korean War, most of North and South Korea became battlefields. The division between North and South Korea was solidified by the military demarcation line, which runs along the 38th parallel. In the end, the war ended with heavy casualties on both sides, and ultimately the situation returned to the way it was before the war. Neither Kim Il-sung's fervent wish to territorial integrity nor Syngman Rhee's fervent wish to northward unification was ever fulfilled. Only a huge scar was left on the Korean peninsula.